very limited time for a few questions. Tenemos un tiempo corto para un par de preguntas. Maybe, quizá alguien nos pueda ayudar con el micrófono para que queden registradas.
So, Luis, I am going to ask you a question as well as to Charles. You are from Medellín, of course, but you are developing your practice, and as well you are a professor in Harvard, and you move now. But so, from the perspective of the United States and as well an institute like the GSD, the vision that you have on the people of the GSD has about Latin America and what is happening here, what challenges are here, what is some singularities that are happening here, thinking as well in the future as well. And I think this event and this initiative that came from the Office for Urbanization as well has the purpose to start and to develop a new process, a new kind of dialogue. And I don't know if you can explain a little bit more what were your intentions and what is your vision about that.
I think Charles can answer better the larger vision. I can. I can talk. It's okay. I can talk a little bit about my perception on the appetite for certain intelligence that are emerging in Latin America, and that I think has two very interesting angles. One is that, at least what I can see in the last 4 years that I've been at Harvard, is that there are more Latin students, and there are more and more every semester, but also students that might not be necessarily from Latin America are starting to have an interest in how we do things here. So I think that's something that I perceive, that I think Charles has a much precise opinion about it, but that for me has been something that was quite unexpected when I went. But I think what is interesting too is that certain spaces that I think are not necessarily in Colombia, I think Urban is becoming that, but certainly Harvard has been a space for that, have the capacity to somehow frame this messy territory of a certain way of doing things that we still need to consolidate a bit more. So one of the, I think, main intuitions that I have about these possible partnerships or connection is also a way to consolidate this know-how in something that is transmissible, but also useful outside tropical context. I don't necessarily believe that the way that we practice and that some of the practices that we have seen along the way only have relevance acting in a strictly tropical context. I think there are some models that are also useful for the world.
I think that's right. Yeah. I mean, you see here, right? We have 4 GSD faculty and a Loeb fellow. So this is the GSD. We're a global school, you know, not having been a student at the GSD and having only recently arrived in the faculty, I understand. I get that. My experience at the GSD was as an outsider as well, and so I took it to be an elite, self-important American institution. But when I arrived there, I see that half our students are from outside the US, more than half our faculty are. We're a global school, and we aspire to have access to the finest students, the best minds, the best designers, the best faculty. And we're actively engaged on an ongoing basis to do that, to recruit faculty, to recruit students. And that's a big process for us. And so we've learned that it's really productive for us to be in the world, to be on the road, to do precisely this. Not because we know a lot about Medellín, But as I said this morning, because we're here to learn, and we in fact need to connect and see what's going on here so that we can continue to renew our faculty. And then I just want to underscore the point that Luis made, which is it's not simply that you're confronting challenges here, but also that we need to learn from your experiences. We, as an institution, have an obligation to produce and disseminate knowledge, and not just in Spanish and not just in the tropics, although yes, in both of those places. And so the office is meant to give us an opportunity to do that without always taking it through teaching, because we've had a long tradition of teaching in which our students are in the world, traveling around to different sites, different subjects, and that's productive, but we want the ability to do that kind of work with local partners around the world, but not just through the teaching program.
There is something I'd like to say and see what your thoughts are, which is, I mean, I'm from Argentina. I'm also a GSD guy, sort of, and then I'm also from Argentina. And it's my first time in Colombia, so I don't know anything about Colombia except the airport of Bogota and today here, and some Colombian friends I have. And I'm very surprised actually about the presentations today. Because, and I wouldn't mix the specificity of what was shown today with other Latin American countries. I think it's a very specific culture here. And something that impressed me a lot was the fact that many of the projects that were shown, or investigations, practices, cultural frameworks, were so clearly grounded in the idea of the territory as a piece of infrastructure. And that idea, I think, and also with a very particular approach, which is, which has a lot of pragmatism on one side, but then on the other it's kind of informed by certain cultural resonances and very clear ones, actually. So I was wondering where all this comes from, actually. I mean, and how much you are aware of the specificity of that culture. Because I don't see that much in other places in Latin America. Like, for example, in Argentina, the culture is much more representational. It's much more about buildings, about forms, about classical background, and much less about performance, about action, about organization. So no, I was just curious about, like, if you could kind of contextualize that, that kind of local specificity.
Yes, I guess some of the answers that some of the questions that you're asking, from my point of view, I will say that have something to do first with the lack of masters of architecture. We've been secluded in the mountains, especially I'm talking about this region. I believe it's impossible to speak about Colombian architecture. Colombia is made of very precise region with very precise cultural dynamics. For a while, the only master that we had in architecture in Colombia, or recognized through the world, was Rogelio Salmona. But I think the permeability he created was mainly around the schools of Bogota. It didn't come through Medellín or other cities in the country. So I think by that lack of masters, or that lack of lineage in that sense of architecture, we had to find a way to do our architecture, to do a kind of relation with with our environment. And in that sense, I know the word that I'm about to use is very hard, a very strong word, perhaps even not polite. But in that sense, I think that we are somehow bastards of architecture, in the sense that we cannot trace a lineage that goes to specific names or specific figures. In that sense, we've been also under very high pressure conditions regarding public space, social mobility, social debts, and with such a fragile ecosystem around our cities and our region, and such a, let's say, sense of belonging to this state of the country with the mountains, the geography, the rivers, the valleys. It has created a very strong sense of responsibility. And with that, I think we have all come to some conclusions, in a sense of fluidity, according to the relation with our teachers. We could trace a very small lineage of relations, of coming back and forth, especially, for example, in the case of my generation, my professors were Alejandro and Elvira. They sit in there, that I would love to hear something that she would like to say, because we have mentioned her name many times today. Then also Felipe Uribe and some others around the age of Ana Elvira, Alejandro, and Felipe. Then my generation, which is a little bit older than Luis and Catalina. My generation is the same as Felipe Mesa, Beta from Opus, also a little bit older than Sebastián. I think we've made some connections between offices and having these conversations. Another fact that I think is important is that it's something that I point out very often in some discussions, but I think it creates also this kind of links and conversation, is that Colombia has no architecture magazines. There are no magazines in Colombia, so this idea of publishing constantly or creating papers, real magazines, I mean real magazines with academical background or at least discussions for the discipline, it doesn't take place on the magazines. Either museums or cultural institutions don't organize architecture exhibitions or urban discussions such as exhibitions or those kind of talks. So we have somehow find ourselves in the need to have these conversations coming back and forth with experiences of going to study abroad and returning, and then having very local conversations that always remain, or always trying to attend these issues about territory, which is what connects us and separates us at the same time. Colombia is a big archipelago. What divides us is the same thing that puts us together, and that's nature and geography.
I just want to add something short, because we are also looking at, as you know, at Chile and Brazil, particularly in this series. And my perception has always been that both Chile and Brazil are cultures of incremental innovation in terms of design. So somehow I feel that they do feel more comfortable to build up on the work of whoever is behind. That's very clear in Brazil. I think in Colombia we have been also a culture of more about ruptures. So it's not necessarily that we don't have masters, it's also that we certainly don't believe apparently in incremental innovation, which puts us in a difficult position, but it's also why there is so much porosity with other fields, like ecology, we partner with biologists, with artists. So it has I think it's quite particular. But it's also a problem.
Yes, I add three things. I don't want to discuss with Camilo and Luis, because we are very proud of ourselves. No, it's a problem. But I would like to ask to add two things. One, this region is our culture belongs to action. We are very connected with action. So, for example, this used to be the industrial city in Colombia. As well, the minery, the textiles, the cement, the biggest group in the country belongs to this region as well. So we do things in the bad way and in the good way. If you can remember our tragedy, we invent as well the roots of the business of the narco cartels and drugs dealers and so on. So as well, so that connection with action, I think you can feel here, because in the way that you say that you see a combination of pragmatism, I think has to be with action as well, with reality. And how can you develop and innovate in different approach as well. But for us as well, in Colombia in general, I'm not talking about Medellín, in Colombia, the reality, I think the recent history pushed us in a very strong way, in terms to confront us with the social reality, with the reality of the territory that put us in contact with the territory itself in more clear and with more proximity. Because that tragedy that happens confront us with that. And I am talking about social and economy as well about the risk as well. So if you see some films that belongs to Victor Gaviria, how I told, some very important novels, like La Virgen de los Sicarios, for example, from Fernando Vallejo, and most of the most powerful and beautiful testimonies from the 80s and 90s permit us to see, and when we were young, the reality of this city. So, so I think it helped us to have not a different kind of sensibility, if I can say, but the other thing, and I must to say that it belongs to politics. Because if you compare with Chile, for example, and you see a lot of those projects and so on, most of them, not all of them, but most of them belongs to the public policies. And with the support with the politicians that they want, in some way they believe in architecture as well, and they have a more closer relation with architects and so on. And so, for example, Luis showed a competition that he won when he was very young, but it was public competition. Catalina as well showed up the competition, and they won with this museum. So the botanical garden was a competition as well. I was close to the process of some of those, but for example, we wanted to have a group of competitors that belongs to all the schools, traditional people with more experience, and some new groups as well. So I think the city started to open the space for a very young people, and you can feel here, because it belongs as well to a generation as well. But the city itself became like a lively lab. So it's a risk as well, because we today belong a lot, I think too much, that the architecture could do a lot of things, and you have to care about it, but it's important.
Okay, I think that, as Camilo said, like we are a part of a generation. For example, I used to work at Camilo's office, and he was also a professor when I was in the university. So I think that also we have a lot of things to do in our country that haven't been done yet. And when we go outside and we study outside, that is like the idea we have of our country, that we have to come back and to do things here because we have a lot of opportunities as a young architects. And as Alejandro said, and it's like the example of also for Sebas, we could won a competition where we were too young, and you won the competition, and then the next day you have to start putting bricks in the building. So you have to learn during the process. You don't know what is going to happen in the construction, and then the next day you are in the construction. So it's very quickly the process, and I think that is a good and a bad thing also, but I think that helps us like to be part of all this architectural process that is happening in our city.
¿Alguna pregunta del público? ¿Están cansados, aburridos? Ani, ¿tú tienes una pregunta? Ah, perdón, no, me dijo Luis. I'm sorry, I'm talking in Spanish, but okay. So, no sé si algún comentario comentario adicional, Ciro.
Maybe our students.
Okay.
I just have a comment. I think this was extraordinary moment in the afternoon to see so many people from Medellín, especially that I hadn't seen for a long time, talking about their projects. And what was for me very touching was to see that the title was about landscape, and that somehow, I don't know if the answer to your question of what we are trying to do is that there's a narrative about tropical landscape, but what I really think is that they are able to understand where we are. And I think that was something, I don't know why it comes, if it's not another answer for zero, because I don't think our studies have put them into that, but somehow there's like this idea that we have to do a space or a special place with these projects. And going back to what Catalina was saying, I also studied abroad and worked abroad, but when I was there and Alejandro was back here in Colombia, I somehow saw that everybody was doing things here. And that's something that really happens here. We really start working really fast, and it's the only way we can measure if what we do is good or bad. Maybe we do bad things, but I really think that the only way that theory can be evaluated is when we can do things. So I'm really happy to see these young people doing all this work, and thank you for doing all.
Gracias.